So we just talked a little bit about sort of the general layout of the nervous system. We talked mainly about the central nervous system. And now we're going to look a little bit more at the peripheral division of the nervous system. So in the peripheral nervous system, we usually use the term nerves more than we do in the central. So when we say nerves, we're looking at usually some larger bundles of neurons, and we're looking at the axons that are extending from them. So just a really quick review of some of this without too much elaboration. We know that there are cranial nerves, and here's a pretty good picture of the 12 cranial nerves going from the top here, from ocular motor, olfactory, optic, trigeminal, facial, etc. So you don't need to remember all of those, but these nerves, which are, as you can see, within we can find them in the basal part of the brain, are part of the peripheral nervous system. And they are connected directly to the brain. Spinal nerves are ones that we typically are also calling somatic nerves, and these are ones that connect to the spinal cord. And then we have all the different nerves that are tracks that go, I should say just nerves that go to the glands and to the internal organs, and we're going to see that too. And they're all a part of this autonomic nervous system, which is also one of the three main areas of peripheral. So peripheral nervous system has cranial nerves, spinal nerves, and this larger thing we're calling autonomic nervous system. So here we have, just to give you a little bit of a view, we've seen the cranial nerves. Now here's some of the spinal nerves that we can look at as they're correlated with segments on the spinal column. So these are little cross sections of the spine itself, and we're seeing at different levels, we're seeing the spinal cord, and it would be its cross section. So you can see that this is ventral. It's labeled that because this would be on her stomach side if we were to cross section it this way, and this would be facing the back. So these are the different regions along the way, part of the peripheral nervous system. We can also look at that in a little bit more detail when we look at the segments themselves. So we can see here is a segment of the spinal cord. This little butterfly pattern in here, where we see the dark, that's where we have gray matter. And remember that gray matter are the cell bodies of neurons and other supporting things within the nervous system. And the white matter represents axon tracks, right? So we're seeing the myelinated part of that right here with the white matter. We have these extensions off here that are part of the motor system and the sensory system, which are the connecting with this thing called the dorsal root ganglion, which we haven't gotten into any real description of before, except for we will when we start talking about pain and pain pathways. So this is, again, spinal cord, spinal nerves, and we can see some of these here. Here's another way to look at it. So this is kind of together with, here's some of the vertebrae, the bony structure that's supporting and protecting the spinal cord. And here you can see some of these spinal nerves running along each side of this. And this is a sympathetic chain, meaning that these particular ones are the part of the sympathetic response in this autonomic nervous system. So that's just kind of good to see. And then this brought up something that it wasn't on, or at least I didn't talk about much before, but you should know, the meninges. So remember, the meninges are these coverings that go around the brain, and they also go around the spinal cord. So we have the tough outer coating, which is the dura mater. We have an interior layer that has a lot of blood vessels called the arachnoid, and then the more delicate and right up against the structures are the cord itself, the pia mater, which means gentle mother. And all of these together combined are called the meninges, and they're protective of the spinal cord, and they also are protective of the brain. So when you get a meningitis, you have an infection of the meninges that can be caused by bacteria and also can be caused by viruses. The peripheral division, again, so we're still on peripheral nervous system. We can look at the autonomic nervous system as having three major divisions: sympathetic, parasympathetic, and then this third one, which we've talked about a little bit, and that's the enteric nervous system. So here's a nice flow chart that kind of shows us that. So we know the brain and the spinal cord are the central, and they're sending information from the brain and spinal cord to different neurons in the body. So this is efferent, meaning it's going away from the brain, and it's going to these different neurons of either the autonomic nervous system, including sympathetic and parasympathetic, or to the somatic. And somatic is the ones that are associated with muscles, so movement, or so neurons that are involved with that type of thing. And then we have the enteric down here, and I like this diagram because it kind of tells you that the enteric nervous system is going to be involved with some activity related to either the sympathetic or the parasympathetic, so that there's a lot of interaction between these. And then going back here, we have sensory neurons that are in the peripheral nervous system that pick up information, and they're going to send it to the brain. That's afferent neurons. So this is going to the brain, or the location where, in this case, it is the brain and spinal cord, and efferent is going away. So these are just to show you this one way to look at this. We can look at peripheral this way too, which I kind of like because it tells you all these, it kind of gives you by the graphics that it's a connector, right? It connects the central nervous system to all these things which have to operate all the time. So the central nervous system has a role in controlling the activities of the organs and the limbs and the skin, carrying information to and from central nervous system, and regulating really basic functions like heartbeat and breathing. This is a really complicated diagram, and you don't need to know it specifically. You've probably seen it before, but it kind of shows you this idea that if we have the brain and the spinal cord, then we have all these different ways that connect out to the body, out to the organs, through these nerves that are coming directly from either a sympathetic chain of ganglion or clusters here along near the spinal cord, to these various organs here, or it could be coming this way from the parasympathetic division. Basically, both of these, or like for example, let's take the heart here. You can see that the heart has activation from the sympathetic side, so we're going to increase, it's going to accelerate the heartbeat, where the parasympathetic is going to have the opposite activity. So they work in tandem, but they also work in opposition to one another depending on the situation. All right. So from there, I'm going to jump into really a brief talk about the development of the nervous system, because we did spend a little time on this, and we looked at how we develop in the first place. So taking it from the simple zygote, that union of sperm and egg that then begins to develop into a cluster of cells. If you remember, we looked at the blastocyst, this like ball of cells. And then ultimately, what you start to see is this thing called a neural tube develop. And the neural tube will first look like just this kind of an outpouching here, where you see in three divisions: a forebrain or prosencephalon, a midbrain section starts to develop, or mesencephalon, and then a hindbrain or a rhombencephalon. So this is a more primitive look at it, right when development is of the nervous system and this neural tube is starting to happen. So in this, we're looking mainly here, if you remember, at the central nervous system, because we'll talk about some other cells being involved with the development of the peripheral nervous system, and those are those neural crest cells. But here we can see it again, and then we see give it a little time and more development, and that forebrain, that prosencephalon, then kind of balloons out a little bit more and has a couple of different areas, one being the telencephalon, which becomes the cerebral cortex, and the diencephalon, which is that area that we're going to see right below cerebral cortex. Then we get to the midbrain, which is, this part doesn't change, this part pretty much stays the same. And then the hindbrain also divides into the met and the myelencephalon, which become the pons and the medulla. And then there's the spinal cord. So just remind you of a little of that. This is what I just said, and those, when we put together the cerebellum and the pons and medulla, we refer to that as the brainstem. So we can see it here as it develops. The neural tube in this early embryonic stage starts to enlarge. We start to see the development of these different areas of the brain. Here we have the telencephalon. There's that diencephalon just right below that. And then we get further development along the way. Now, this really tells us what happens if, and it says, well, we talk about telencephalon. What we're looking at is the cortex, the basal ganglia, and the limbic system. We have the diencephalon, which is that thalamus and hypothalamus region. The mesencephalon stays mesencephalon. And then we have the met, which includes the pons, but also includes the cerebellum. And then the myelencephalon, or the medulla. And so you can kind of see how that works. And then we can get down into this part here, the autonomic ganglia. This would be the peripheral nervous system coming from the neural crest cells, and ultimately starts to subdivide into these two divisions. Within the central nervous system, these are just terms that we use. So if we say a nucleus, we're really referring to these collections of cell bodies that we've been talking about, particularly with certain neurotransmitters that are found in particular regions within the central nervous system. When we use the term tract, T-R-A-C-T, that's just a bundle of axons that are moving somewhere. Now, in the peripheral nervous system, we use the term ganglia to represent this same idea of these cell bodies. And we use the bundles of axons, we say are that's when we call them just nerves. So it's just vocabulary that's specific to either the central or the peripheral nervous system. The only other thing on here that I wanted to mention is just this idea that the brain and us, in many respects, we are bilaterally symmetrical, which means that we have kind of a mirror image of sorts on each side. So when we're looking at areas over here, there are corresponding areas on the opposite side of the brain as well that are activating in tandem very often with this side. So part of the things like corpus callosum are those things which are connectors between these two hemispheres and the areas within the brain that do comparable things on each side. Now, there are some exceptions to that, but you have a left and a right hippocampus. You have a left and a right amygdala. So that's what we mean by this idea of we are symmetrical on each side. And if we're going across from one side to the other, and they're showing you this kind of nicely here, when we talk about that idea of connections that are going from one side of the brain to the other, one side of the body to the other, we use the term contralateral. If something is going on the same side, we call it ipsilateral. And then if it has just something that's equivalent on each side, like we just mentioned here, we call it bilateral. So this is just ways of looking at it. We're going to see a lot of this when we talk about some of the pain pathways coming up, but I just thought I'd show you that right now. So that's it.